Terence McKenna, for those of you who don't know, was somewhat of a legend among psychedelic users. And I say was because unfortunately he passed away at a rather young age. He was not only somebody who experimented with psychedelics for recreational purposes, just to kind of see what happens, but he was also intellectually engaged with the puzzle of psychedelics and trying to sort of figure out why the psychedelic experience occurs and kind of mapping the experience from a subjective point of view. And he had an amazing way of capturing both the beauty of psychedelics and the sheer terror. And he always approached these things with a critical attitude, with like a show me kind of attitude. He always wanted to see for himself what the big deal was, and that's why he experimented personally with these drugs. And he was an extremely elegant speaker, and through his discussions of DMT in particular, you really get a sense of the utter alienness. Now, this video will be using a lot of archival footage of Terence McKenna's experiences, of him discussing his experiences, so you can hear for yourself how he describes his experience, and he's a very elegant speaker.
I want to talk about what to my mind is the quintessential hallucinogen, and consequently the quintessential spiritual and magical tool of this dimension, and that is DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a compound that occurs in the human nervous system. It occurs in many, many plants. It is the commonest hallucinogen in all of nature. And I don't know how you got to where you are this afternoon, but the way I got here is by testing and by hoping and by pursuing a magical, if that's the word, a miraculous, a transcendental ideal that over the course of life, experience strips from you. You have to get a job. Your first love is not your last love. Slowly, this pristine, shining belief in perfectibility is eroded by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, the dark oxen that turn the millstones of the world. But I'm here to tell you that it is real. There is a doorway into another dimension. Aladdin's lamp is real. Fairyland is real. Magic is real in the most real sense, in the same sense that what we call reality is real. And I learned this through this compound.
He personally believed that DMT could be used to unlock the secrets of the universe, but at the same time admitted that it's an extremely terrifying and jarring experience, which is fully difficult to process, and there are certain elements of the experience which are seemingly intransmissible, as if language itself is just unequipped to be able to transfer this experience or transmit this experience through words. It seems like in order to really grasp it, you have to have it yourself. It would seem that language is insufficient for the task.
So what is it then? Well, it's an experience, and I maintain it's the most intense experience you can have this side of the yawning grave, without doubt. I mean, people say, is it dangerous? Well, the answer is only if you fear death by astonishment. Yes, that's a joke here. It's not a joke there, because you find yourself literally holding your heart to verify that you have not, in fact, had a coronary thrombosis induced by wonder, terror, reverence, and astonishment.
Now, McKenna happened to have a breakthrough experience the first time he smoked DMT, which is pretty rare because you do need to smoke a decent amount and you do have to kind of get used to it. And you can imagine how just crazy this must have been, having absolutely no expectations going in, which is why when he suddenly found himself in hyperspace surrounded by what he describes as these self-dribbling machine elves, his initial belief, his sort of immediate reaction was to just assume that he had died. And this is actually very common. A lot of people who take large amounts of DMT report that they feel like they're dying, and that that they convince themselves rather quickly that they have passed away, and that's what's happened, that they've died and gone to somewhere else, which is interesting to note.
I mean, you get in there for about 70 seconds, the first 35 of which is taken up with you checking all your meters to make sure you're not dead, because that's what you assume. You say, I did it, I'm dead, I'm dead. And then you say, but chest rising and falling, thoughts continuing in linear progression. Apparently, I'm not dead.
So according to McKenna, DMT feels like you're being lifted out of your body very rapidly, and very rapidly shot through this kind of kaleidoscopic vision, this kind of kaleidoscopic tunnel, until you reach some sort of a mandala-shaped door, which he called the chrysanthemum. And this is actually another very common occurrence where people sort of report this kaleidoscopic looking door, this kind of like membrane structure, looks like a mandala. And this is actually how he defines the breakthrough experience. You know, a sub-threshold experience, so below the amount you need to break through, people can come across this door but not go through it. A breakthrough is when you actually burst through the membrane. You actually go beyond this door, and that's sort of when you enter this super hyperdimensional realm with all of the entities. That's where you find yourself in the DMT dimension.
And there is definitely somewhere in here a threshold which you must exceed. And when you do that, this membrane-like thing, this chrysanthemum, will actually part, and there is a sound like the crumpling of a plastic bread wrapper or the crackling of flame. A friend of mine says this is the radio intellechy of your soul exiting through the anterior fontanelle at the top of your head. Could be. In any case, this crackling sound and a tone, and then there's this impression of transition, and you're now 20 seconds deep into this experience. There's an impression of transition. It's as though there were a series of tunnels or chambers that you are tumbling down, being propelled by some kind of muscle behind you that is pushing you.
He then describes the impression of being in some kind of a dome-like structure. You feel like you're deep beneath the earth almost. That's the way he would describe it. And he describes seeing the walls and that they're covered with this complex geometric patterning, and the whole vibe is very machine-like. It's like as if you're in some kind of extremely advanced, technologically sophisticated civilization. But before you can even take in just how different this place is compared to your ordinary reality, you are greeted by thousands of entities, which he famously described as machine elves. That would be like almost like these self-dribbling basketball things, and they seem to almost swarm him and congratulate him. Now, this is of course very intense and something that nobody really expects, and that's how your mind perceives it, as being really intense and almost like too much to comprehend. Like, what the hell's going on? What the hell's going on? Why am I in this place?
But it is a completely confounding experience. I mean, you may have had the expectation, you might think if you had never had a psychedelic experience, that it sort of begins like the Bach B minor fugue and goes from there as you rise into the realms of light and union with the deity or something like that. That's not what happens on DMT. What happens on DMT I referred to this morning. A troop of elves smashes down your front door and rotates and balances the wheels on the after-death vehicle, present you with the bill, and then depart. And it's completely paradigm shattering. I mean, union with the white light you could handle. An invasion of your apartment by jeweled self-dribbling basketballs from hyperspace that are speaking in demotic Greek is not something that you anticipated and could handle. Sometimes people say, is DMT dangerous? It sounds so crazy. Is it dangerous? The answer is only if you fear death by astonishment.
Now, here's something quite bizarre. McKenna's first reaction to seeing this place is being appalled, likely at just how unexpected the experience is and how shocking it is. But he claims that the drug actually leaves him more or less the same. So you are essentially the same person when you go to this DMT dimension. Nothing about you is different, so he claims. Other people report something else, that they do change. But, he reports that your mental state is more or less unchanged by the drug. What's happened instead is your entire environment, everything around you, has been totally replaced by something else, something completely unexpected and something completely different from what you're ordinarily used to.
A little bit more about it. One thing that endears DMT to me is I like to say it doesn't affect your mind. It doesn't seem to affect your mind. In other words, you don't change under the influence of DMT. You don't become a kinder, gentler person. You don't sink into, a line of drool from one corner of your mouth as you sit there twitching. You don't change. What happens is the world is completely replaced. Instantly, 100%, it's all gone. And what is put in its place, not one iota of what is put in its place was taken from this world. So it's a 100% reality channel switch. They don't even retain three-dimensional space and linear time. It's not like you go to an exotic place, Morocco or New Guinea. It's like reality is swapped out for something else. And when you try to say what it is, you realize that language has evolved in this world and it can serve no other. It takes years of practice. So what you're looking at is literally the unspeakable. The indescribable falls into your lap. And when you try, you're loaded, right? You're there, and you're trying to explain to yourself what's happening. And so this is like you try to pour water over the transdimensional objects in front of you, the water of language, and it just beads up and flows off like water off a duck's back. You cannot say what's there. And I've spent, 25 years fiddling with this. It's become the compass of my inspiration, trying to say what is on the other side of that boundary. Just 2 large tokes away at any given time is this non-Euclidean, non-Newtonian, irrational, un-Englishable place. But it's not smooth and empty and clear. That's not what gives it its indescribability. What gives it its indescribability is its utter weirdness, its alienness, its power to astonish.
What happens when you smoke DMT, this DMT dimension and these entities, it seems to be utterly disconnected from what happens in this, in this reality. Utterly irrelevant. It has nothing to do with our world. Nothing which exists in our world mirrors anything in the DMT world, with perhaps a few exceptions, which we'll discuss later. But it does seem to be like a different place where the entities there have different priorities. And the entities, and people often report seeing thousands of them, or at least huge numbers of them, are extremely strange and alien, and yet they're friendly, and they supposedly greet you excitedly. They're very excited that you somehow discovered this DMT dimension.
It's extremely multiplistic, and it's extremely specific in its presentation. And when you smoke DMT, you have the feeling that you have burst into a place, that you have not had a psychological experience, you are not having a mental experience, you have burst into some kind of a space. And within that space, the first shock is that it's inhabited. And this is the shock I've never recovered from, because it was just the last thing I expected to find inside a chemical compound was the equivalent of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. It is inhabited by entities, is the only word to describe them. And they are, as I've said many times, they are like jeweled, self-dribbling basketballs. And there are many of them. And they come out of the background and they present themselves to you. They're literally vibrating up and down with excitement. They're faceted and rotating. And they see you as clearly as you see them. They even greet you.
Now, McKenna gives a lot of detail as to what these entities actually do. And what they seem to be doing to him was that they were able to jump in and out of his chest. Very bizarre. And they were also able to sing, but it wasn't as if they were just singing and it was just beautiful music coming out. This music seemed to be able to vibrate the air in front of him and create objects. Again, very strange and very, magical and fantastical. But the very interesting thing about these objects is that Terence McKenna would claim that if you were to see one of these objects, they would be so perplexing in their nature, so dynamic, that you would have this innate feeling, this immediate recognition that if you were to bring this object to Earth, all of reality would be changed forever. That we would be studying this object forever just because of how insanely complicated and insanely advanced it was. The way I think about it is imagine going back in time and 1,000 years ago and then showing a person an iPhone. Obviously to us an iPhone is nothing particularly special. We know relatively well how it functions. But imagine if I showed that to somebody 1,000 years ago. It would completely blow their mind. They would not understand how this thing could exist, with its bright colors and the fact that, you can read from it and all that interesting stuff. It would boggle the mind as to how something like that could exist. Well, you go to this DMT world and apparently you can find objects and technology that's so advanced, seemingly, again, I'm not saying any of this is necessarily the case. It just seems like that when you go there. But it seems like these objects are so advanced that if you were to bring them to Earth, nobody would be able to understand how they actually work. They're just too mind-boggling and too, far beyond our current level of technology.
They sing, and out of their singing elfin chatter condense objects, which look like nothing at all in this world. I mean, the closest I've been able to come to them are the eggs of Fabergé. These constructs in sapphire and ivory and crystal and vitreous glass that the French designer Fabergé created. Well, these things are like that, but they're like that raised to some excruciating pinnacle of completion, because as they show you these objects, you know beyond any possibility of contravention that if a single one of these objects were to exist in this world, it would change this world forever. If a single one of these objects were to exist in this world, we would spend 1,000 years studying this object. The last time this happened was a guy gave a speech up on a hill about moral obligation. We studied it for 1,000 years. This is the same kind of thing. And these Fabergé hyperdimensional objects are themselves undergoing a dynamic transformation. They're not static objects like the Fabergé eggs. They are undergoing changes, singing, condensing other objects. These objects are crawling all over the ground in front of you, clamoring for your attention. Now remember, 12 seconds before you were sitting in a suburban living room somewhere grappling with some drug somebody wanted you to take. Now all that's gone. And here are these things.
Now, obviously, something like this is extremely overwhelming, and the whole thing takes a very long time to end. And so it's like being on a roller coaster that just doesn't stop, because, you know, it's a very intense experience, and so much is happening that you're just kind of like, okay, can I take a break now? Like, can this stop? But it just keeps going. But the elves, according to Terence McKenna, told him not to get lost in the spectacle, not to just go Googa and, stare in amazement at the walls and stuff. They wanted him to pay attention to what was going on, and actually make note of what was happening rather than, just kind of losing your mind. Now, these entities are quite insistent on making sure that you understand what they're trying to say. They really try to give you a message for you to take back, and, I guess, supposedly communicate to everybody else. But the problem is that it seems like whenever anybody goes to this DMT dimension, they don't have the words to describe it. It's like language evolved in this reality to encapsulate certain ideas which are relevant to our lives. And so when you find yourself in a completely different world, seemingly, you just don't have the words to describe it. Even the words I'm using right now probably don't capture what it's really like. You may have a certain impression, and the odds are whatever impression you're getting is not accurate to the actual experience. The actual experience is probably significantly more intense and significantly more complicated than how I'm merely depicting it. And so, this experience is literally indescribable. I can describe it to the best of my abilities, but really you have to go there to understand what it's like. Now, one thing that's very interesting and kind of unique to McKenna's experiences is that he claimed that they had different forms of communication. Sometimes they would speak in this demotic Greek-sounding language, and he would somehow be able to understand it, but sometimes they would also just speak plain English. And the fact that they'd speak plain English seems to suggest that this is really just a hallucination, right? Because how else could they sort of speak the language that we speak unless it's coming from your mind, right? Well, McKenna himself didn't believe that at all. He believed that the experience was real as my voice right now, as real as the image that you're seeing. It was undeniably real. Like, if you had the experience yourself, he would claim that there's no way you could deny it. It definitely happened. Something happened. You went to a different place. You were greeted by thousands of entities. They sung these objects into existence. They danced around and did crazy things. And then you returned back to your body. Like, when you have the experience, you're totally convinced that this happened. Just as you're probably convinced that I am speaking to you right now. It's just as real as that, if not more real.
The point I want to make is it's real. It's not vague. You don't have to strain for it. Nobody wonders whether or not it happened to them. It's just like somebody walking up to you and taking you by the arm and saying, there's something I insist on showing you. Come this way, please. And it was the presence of the entities that shattered the person who I was, because I was a scientific rationalist, a reductionist. I had no room for elves in my cosmology. And here they were, hundreds of them. So it seems to me that this is a central question that shamanism has always dealt with, perhaps not with the kind of ontological sophistication that we imagine ourselves to have, but this is the question that must be asked. Who's in there? Who is this?
But some of the differences between McKenna's experiences and the more sort of typical experiences, which I've studied, are important to note. So one of them is the fact that these entities can speak English. He's the only person I've seen that's actually reported that. Most people report that the entities don't speak at all. They communicate, but it's not through language in our sense. It's some other form of communication, which is difficult to describe. Another thing is the fact that they create these objects using their songs. That's not commonly reported. It's possible that people just don't report it because it's too hard to believe, or they just don't remember that part of the experience, but it's an important thing to note going forward. Now, one of the mysteries of DMT, according to McKenna, is the fact that why don't more people know about it? Here's this drug which can, from a subjective point of view, take you to what you perceive to be another dimension, and yet it isn't being rigorously studied. I mean, like, how is it not being rigorously studied? Like, is experiencing external entities not that significant, not worth scientific consideration? Is pretty crazy. And he says that, and this is his opinion, that trying to rationalize the experience by saying it's just a hallucination, is horseshit. Like, anybody, even I could just say it's probably just a hallucination, but according to people who actually have the experience, it's seemingly impossible for the human mind to generate that level of detail, especially when the level of detail seems to be greater than that which exists in the world when you're awake. And the entities, again, they are seemingly real. They have their own personalities, and they perceive you as clearly as you perceive them. Now, obviously, Terence McKenna's conviction that this place is real conflicts with the kind of fantastical nature of the experience, like singing objects into existence. Like what's that about? That doesn't seem possible, even if it does feel real. So that gives us reason to doubt the experience. But again, he was totally convinced that it wasn't merely hallucination, whatever that means.
And it's completely real. It's in a way more real than the contents of ordinary reality, because see how the shadows here are muted, and there's a lot of transitional zones from one color to another and so forth. This isn't like that. This is crystalline, clear, solid. You can see the light reflected in the depths of these objects, and everything is very brightly colored, and everything is moving very, very rapidly. And there are entities there. It's not about calling them up or the whisperings of them. No, they're in your face. And they're right here, and they're worse than in your face, because what they do is they jump into your chest, and then they jump out. And so you're like this. And you have to keep saying, keep breathing, don't freak out, pay attention. And the entities speak to you. And they speak both in English and another way, which we'll get to in a minute. But in English, what they say is, do not give way to wonder. Hang on. Don't just go gaga with disbelief. Pay attention. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to show you something. They are very aware of the fleeting nature of this encounter. And they say, don't just spiral off into amazement and start raving about God and all that. Forget that. Pay attention to what we're doing. And then what they're doing is they're dancing around, they're jumping around, they're emerging explicitly out of the background, bounding toward you, jumping into your chest, bounding away, and they make offerings, and they love you. That's the other thing. They say this. They say, we love you. You come so rarely, and here you are, welcome, and then they make these offerings, and the offerings are objects of some sort.
So Terence McKenna was a Jungian, and was very knowledgeable about art history and mythology and sort of the different motifs which arise from the human mind. And so when people often hear about these entities that you see with DMT, often Jung comes to mind, because Jung also explored kind of the entities which arise from the mind in the form of complexes and archetypes. And yet, according to Terence McKenna, and this is quite shocking, is these entities and this DMT world doesn't seem to have any archetypal basis. There is no known archetype that humans have produced that we have sort of put into our mythology or into our stories or into our art motifs that bears any relation to the DMT experience. There are some exceptions, but they are relatively rare, and things like Santa Claus gnomes could have some kind of relation to the DMT experience, but not really, because just because you see elves in this DMT experience doesn't mean they look or even feel like the elves of that we've created. But there are some kind of slight similarities. But the point being is that it doesn't seem like this is a realm of the unconscious. It doesn't seem like that at all. It seems like, again, like you're going to a different place.
What completely blew my mind about DMT, and I mention it again, here's an opportunity for research, is how here's a heretical construction, how trans-archetypal the content of the flash seemed. I was appalled, because not only had I a certain amount of interest in Jung and proclivity along those lines, but my original major had been art history. Art historians, what we're trained to do is to be able to look at a motif and say, oh yes, I'm familiar with this from ceramic from second millennia Peru, and also Mandaean embroidery work. We know motifs. We're trained to recognize and connect disparate aesthetic domains. Well, when I smoked DMT and came down, I said, this is not on the map. I can't believe it. This doesn't connect up to anything. How can there be domains of the human mind that do not announce themselves in folklore, fairy tales, dreams, or mandala painting, that are so removed from the ven of what is human that they are apparently not accessible in structuring our maps of ourself and our psyche? And that for me was the contact with what I call, and I didn't call it this, Rudolf Otto called it this, and this term influenced Jung, Otto preceded Jung, it is the wholly other. And if there is an archetype of the wholly other, then this is it. But perhaps the wholly other transcends the archetypes.
And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, that that the experience occurs outside the mind. We definitely shouldn't jump to conclusions here, but I am trying to explain what this definitely does feel like. That a lot of people report this feeling, this very uncanny feeling that this experience happened in another place, and it wasn't just an intense visual hallucination. Now, he proposes multiple explanations for what could be happening, all of which are completely crazy and hard to believe, especially if you've ever tried this yourself. The first explanation, and there's a couple, but I'll just stick with a few, is that these are somehow aliens, that you are encountering extraterrestrials, that somehow contact us through our minds. They don't contact us through spaceships, apparently. They do so through mind. Which again sounds completely crazy, but just imagine for a second what kind of an experience a person would have to actually believe this theory. It would have to be so convincing that something like this actually does seem tenable. And I also want to just emphasize the fact, and this is just kind of my own opinion, that imagine if aliens did come to Earth and did sort of reveal themselves and show themselves to us. It would be like the most extraordinary event in history. Well, it seems like DMT allows for an event of this scale. And again, it isn't being rigorously studied. Not that many people know about DMT, and even those that do know about it don't take it that seriously. They don't, just kind of, rationalize the experience away that this is just a hallucination. And yet Terence McKenna, he didn't come to this conclusion, but he considered the possibility that he was literally meeting aliens that for some reason come through the mind. It's, again, sounds crazy, but the experience is that convincing. Now, another explanation, and I believe it's the one that he favored, is that DMT takes you to the place where you go after you die. In other words, it takes you to the afterlife. And for some reason, DMT is able to give you a preview of the afterlife.
Clear metaphor, anyway, for what's happening in there. And I think a lot of people have this experience. When you talk to shamans, they say, oh, well, yes, the helping spirits. Those are the helping spirits. They can help you cure, find lost object. You didn't know about helping spirits? I said, well, I knew, but I had no idea, that it was so literal. Say, oh, no, that's the helping spirits. But then the other thing they say, if you press a shaman, if you say, well, what exactly is a helping spirit? Say, well, a helping spirit is an ancestor. Say, you mean to tell me that those are dead people in there? Say, well, yes, ancestor, dead person. You didn't know about ancestors, apparently. This is what happens to people who die. And you say, my God, is it possible that what we're breaking into here is an ecology of souls? That these are not extraterrestrials from Zenebel Ganubi or Zeta Reticuli Beta. These are the dear departed. And they exist in a realm which, for want of a better word, let's call eternity. And somehow this drug, or whatever it is allowing me to see across the veil. This is the lifting. You want to talk about boundary dissolution. It's one thing to get tight to your partner. It's quite another to get tight to the dear departed of centuries past. That's a serious boundary dissolution.
Now, if that notion makes you uncomfortable or skeptical, which it did for me, just know that Terence McKenna had to decondition himself from his Catholic beliefs. And he was initially raised Catholic and believed in God, but sort of had to leave all that behind and sort of became convinced that there's no such thing as the afterlife, because how could you prove it? And no such thing as sort of the transcendent other, no such thing as gods or angels or any of that. But this DMT experience convinced him that the afterlife might really exist after all. Not only the afterlife, but the fact that this afterlife is inhabited with beings who might exist on a different plane. Which again, he describes it as the sort of encounter with the transcendent other. He never expected that he would ever encounter entities which seemingly exist in another place, and which seemingly watch us from wherever this is. Now, obviously, this afterlife which he proposes is very different from what's described by most religions. My point is that the experience really can convince you that, even if you're a rational skeptic, that you do go to a different place. And this other place is more real than reality itself, almost like this universe that you live in is an illusion. It's just some kind of hallucination. And that DMT place, that DMT dimension, that's the real world. That's where you're supposed to be. This is just some sort of drug trip almost.
The reason the DMT space feels so peculiar, both alien and excruciatingly familiar, is because these things in this other place represent what I call an ecology of souls. This place is the one place you never thought you were going to make a visit to and come back to chat it around the coffee maker. They're dead. That's who these things are. This is the realm of the dead. Well, I have to confess, in all of my psychedelic voyaging and idea mongering and all of that, I never was able to go that far, to reach that far in my imagination. It sort of had to be presented to me. But if you go to shamans worldwide and talk to them about their spirit helpers and say, what's the deal with this? Who are these things? And they say, well, these are the ancestors. Didn't you know? These are the ancestors.
So if all these theories from Terence McKenna sound far-fetched, and they kind of do, he would say that there is a fairly easy way to test whether he's right or wrong, and that is everybody smokes DMT and has the breakthrough experience, and you can see for yourself. And that's one of the things I want to emphasize. This is a very unique experience because, somebody might try to convince you that ghosts exist. And they might say, well, I can perceive the ghosts and I can tell you that they exist. But then you'd have to kind of just take their word for it. Well, DMT isn't like that because everybody, I don't know if you should do this, but everybody could take DMT themselves and see for themselves. If you're skeptical, you can check for yourself and see whether this experience actually does take you to another world or not. It's not like when people just try to convince you without any evidence. Here you can actually have the experience yourself and see what it's all about. It's a very different thing compared to sort of most other proofs of God or proofs of the afterlife. Now, the last thing I want to say about his experience is that there's something very eerie going on with DMT, something so alien that happens in this experience that you can't bring it back. And he hints at it being so startling that the human mind just seems to naturally reject it. It's so something that you were not expecting to encounter, and it's so different from what you were expecting that your mind just kind of goes, no, I don't believe it, even though you see it directly. And he thinks that this might have something to do with his afterlife theory, that again, the human mind isn't ready to comprehend the afterlife. If you come into contact with the afterlife, you're naturally going to be like, that was weird. So if you come into contact with undeniable proof of the afterlife, there's a good chance that your brain will just immediately reject it because you didn't expect to see something like that. Why would a person ever expect to see the afterlife while they're alive? It's just crazy. And that's why the mind does seem to kind of just throw this experience away. Like, you really can't comprehend what's going on.
By this time, most people would like to call time out so they can make phone calls to various philosophers. But there's no time out. It just keeps going. And these things have the aura of strangeness, of alienness is palpable. There's an emotion in there that we just don't have in this world because it's composed of unbelievable alienness in the presence of unbelievable familiarity. It's an ecstasy that is a coincidentia oppositorum. Simultaneously, it is both what it is and what it is not. And the human mind can't handle that. That's called cognitive dissonance. I mean, you just go into a conniption fit of some sort. Well, the very first time I smoked DMT in 1967, with absolutely no expectation, this happened to me.
So, again, I've discussed a lot of DMT experiences, and I probably will be discussing a few more, but I'll give a more sort of general summary rather than going through individual experiences. But I want you all to just sit with this and contemplate what all of this seems to suggest, and think about how we can account for an experience like this. Again, you don't have to take Terence McKenna's word on faith that this is the afterlife or that you're meeting aliens, but you can sort of start to think, what are the logical explanations for an experience like this, and what do experiences like this fundamentally imply about the human brain? So next time we'll start looking at the possible ways to account for the DMT experience and sort of theorize about what's actually going on, but I do warn you that the theories I came up with to explain this experience are not any less crazy than what Terence McKenna said, but I do think I have reasonable reason to think this way, and there is a way to sort of test whether I'm right or wrong. So look forward to that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.